Hi everyone, and welcome to my lab presentation. Today we're going to focus on the anatomy of the gluteal, thigh, leg, and foot regions. This lecture will include bones and ligaments, muscles, the arteries, veins, and nerves associated with them, mnemonics to help memorize, and even some clinical applications. Alright, so starting at the top of the lower limb, otherwise known as the thigh region, we have the femur. The areas of the femur we have to focus on is the head, which is attached to the hip by sitting inside of the acetabulum. You don't have to know the acetabulum for this lecture, but just in case you forgot, the acetabulum is the socket of the hip bone. After the head, there's a thinner structure that leads from the rest of the femur, which is known as the neck. These two are easy to remember because you can just imagine there's a little small face on the round part of the femur, as I've done in the picture, and it'll give you the names for both the head and the neck. After that portion, we have the greater and lesser truncators. The greater truncator is the other bulge on top of the femur, aside from the head. It is much less prominent compared to the head, but it still extends laterally from the shaft of the bone. The lesser truncator, on the other hand, is located slightly below the head, and it's another small bump extending from the shaft. Moving to the bottom of the femur, you notice a smooth lip in the center that is known as the patellar groove. On either sides of the patellar groove, there are condyles that are named based on their locations. The medial condyle will be located on the same side of the head, since the head will always be attached to the hip bone via the acetabulum. Therefore, it will always be facing towards the center of the body. This leaves the other side as the lateral condyle, and it will be on the same side as the greater truncator. Some movements that are possible at the hip joint, which is the attachment between the femur and the hip bone at the acetabulum, is hip extension, abduction, and adduction. As we reach the bottom of the femur, we have the knee. The knee is found between the femur and the tibia primarily, which is the main bone in the second half of the lower limb, otherwise known as the leg. When looking at the knee anteriorly, the first ligament that's immediately noticeable is in the center, and it is known as the patellar ligament. It is named the patellar ligament because of the patella, which is a small circular bone found posteriorly to the patellar ligament. Similarly, this is where the patellar groove on the femur gets its name as well. Moving on to the sides, we have the collateral ligaments. These ligaments are also named after locations, medial and lateral, but the reference point this time is the fibula, which is the small bone located on the lateral side next to the tibia. Therefore, the lateral collateral ligament is attached to the fibula, while the medial collateral ligament is attached to the tibia. In addition to the medial collateral ligament is also attached to the medial meniscus, which sits on the medial side of the tibia. The lateral collateral ligament does not attach to the lateral meniscus because it's attached to the fibula, so it sits too far out. The final two ligaments, which you can only see by turning it to the side, is the anterior cruciate ligament and the posterior cruciate ligament, otherwise known as ACL and PCL. The ACL is attached to the anterior end of the tibia and the posterior end of the femur, while the PCL does the opposite. The ACL is tight when your leg is extended or stretched out, while the PCL is tight during flexion, which is when you bend your knee. As you probably know though, many people develop injuries at their knee throughout their lifetime. One of the most common injuries is a torn ACL, so doctors will often check to make sure everything is alright. The method to check this is by attempting to move the tibia anteriorly and posteriorly. If it can be moved anteriorly, then the ACL has been torn. Meanwhile, if the tibia can be moved posteriorly, then the PCL has been torn. While these injuries might have to be fixed with surgery, there's an even more extreme injury. Just to paint an example, let's say you're playing hockey. You're blocking the puck from an attacker when he shoots and it hits the lateral side of your knee. If it was hit the knee hard enough, it would tear the medial collateral ligament. However, it would also tear the medial meniscus because it is attached to the medial collateral ligament. Even the ACL, which is tight since the leg would be extended, would tear. This is known as the unhappy triad injury and requires immediate medical attention. This cannot happen on the lateral side though, because the lateral collateral ligament is not attached to the lateral meniscus. This is because the popliteus muscle goes through this gap, which is a muscle we will focus on later. Overall, it shows that we need to be careful with our knees, because we can easily be put in a situation that's not so funny. The next bones in the lower limb are the tibia and the fibula, which are found in the leg. Starting with the tibia, it has the tibial plateau located at the top of the tibia. This is the flat area where the menisci sit from the knee joint. On the anterior side of the tibia is the tibial tuberosity, which is a small triangular bulge. After that, we move to the bottom of the tibia where there's a small notch that points downwards that is known as the medial malleolus. This will always be located on the medial side of the tibia, so it is a good point of reference for orientation. Moving on to the fibula, which sits laterally from the tibia, there are two distinct areas you need to know. At the top of the fibula, there's the head, which is simply a circular bulge at the top. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the fibula has a notch that is known as the lateral malleolus. In the area between these two bones, there's a ligament known as the interosseous membrane, which is a very tight border and prevents much movement between these bones. This membrane separates the anterior and posterior leg, which will help us categorize the muscles later. The final set of bones we will look at in this lecture are the foot bones. These bones are separated into 3 different categories: the tarsals, the metatarsals, and the phalanges. If we start with the tarsals, which is comprised of 7 different bones, then the most posterior bone is known as the calcaneus. This bone is known as the ball of the foot and helps create the curve of the foot. The next bone is the talus, which is the bone that is attached to the tibia and fibula and forms the ankle joint. The ankle joint is actually responsible for dorsiflexion and plantar flexion of the foot. The next 2 bones, moving anteriorly, are the navicular and the cuboid bone. The joint between the talus and the 3 bones I've mentioned before are known as the intertarsal joint, which is responsible for inversion and eversion of the foot. This movement is remnant of a more significant movement from when we were our tree-hanging predecessors. Interesting, right? The final tarsal bones are the cuneiforms, which are separated into the medial, intermedial, and lateral cuneiforms based on the location in the foot. After the tarsal bones, we have the metatarsals, which are 1 bone for each toe. Finally, we have the metatarsals, which are comprised of the proximal, intermediate, and distal phalanges. The proximal phalange is the bone closest to the metatarsal bone, while the distal phalange is the bone that is furthest away from the metatarsals. Each toe has 3 phalanges with the exception of the big toe, which only has 2, despite my drawing. That's a little tip you get for listening to the lecture. Congrats. Now, we're going to start with the most superior muscles in the gluteal region and make our way down. The first muscle that is the most superficial in the gluteal region is the gluteus maximus. This muscle is the most superficial muscle and is responsible for hip extension. If you flip this muscle over, then you'll find the gluteus medius, which is responsible for hip abduction. It attaches to the iliac crest and fans out from there. When you flip over the gluteus medius, then you'll find a ton more muscles. The first one, which is closest to the iliac crest, is the gluteus minimus, which is responsible for hip abduction as well. Sitting on top of it is a thick-looking nerve, which is known as the superior gluteal bundle. There is a triangular muscle adjacent to the gluteus minimus that seems to sit on top of it. This is known as the piriformis. The piriformis is a sciatic nerve coming from below it, and it extends down into the lower limb. The next muscle on the other side of the piriformis is the obturator internus, and it is also triangularish in shape. The final muscle in this region is slightly separated from the others and appears as a small rectangle that is closest to the obturator internus. This is known as the quadratus femoris. These muscles are responsible for hip lateral rotation. Now, the next set of muscles are the anterior thigh muscles. These muscles begin with a muscle band that crosses the anterior leg superficially. It is known as the sartorius, and it is responsible for hip and knee flexion. The muscles in the center is located under it is known as the rectus femoris and has a distinct feather appearance. It deals with hip flexion and knee extension. Below the rectus femoris is a set of 3 muscles known as the vastus muscles. The most medial muscle is the vastus medialis. The center muscle, which sits under the rectus femoris, is the vastus intermedius. Finally, the most lateral muscle is the vastus lateralis. These muscles deal with knee extension. After that, we have the medial thigh muscles. The most superficial muscle of the medial section is the gracialis, which is a long band that runs on the inside of the leg. It is responsible for hip abduction and hip flexion. Under the gracialis is a large muscle known as the adductor magnus. This is the largest muscle in the medial compartment of the leg. Below the adductor magnus, there is a thin and long muscle known as the adductor longus. The final muscle in the medial compartment is the adductor brevis, which sits under the adductor longus. All the adductor muscles are responsible for hip adduction. The final area of the thigh is the posterior thigh. The posterior thigh is comprised of 3 muscles. The most lateral of those muscles is the bicep femoris, which can be found as 2 long heads that both attach to the fibula. They both assist in knee flexion, but the long head that attaches to the ischial tuberosity as well is also a hip extensor. The next muscle is the semitendinosus, which is medial compared to the bicep femoris. This muscle has a large tendon attached to it, which is where it gets its name from. Below the semitendinosus is the semimembranosus, which is much wider. These muscles are responsible for hip extension and knee flexion. As for the vasculature in the thigh, there are a few significant arteries, veins, and nerves to take note of. First of all, the common femoral vein can be found in the femoral triangle alongside the femoral artery and the femoral nerve on the anterior side. The common femoral vein has a branch that can be seen superficially, which is known as the great saphenoid vein. The obturator nerve can also be seen on the anterior side, on top of the adductor brevis. On the posterior side, the sciatic nerve moves down the leg after appearing under the piriformis. Alongside it is the popliteal artery and vein located behind the knee. Moving to the leg, we begin by looking at the anterior leg. The most central muscle that sits on top of the tibia is the tibialis anterior. This muscle dorsiflexes the ankle. The muscle found laterally to the tibialis anterior is the extensor digitorum longus. This muscle both dorsiflexes the ankle and extends the toes. Under the tibialis anterior and next to the extensor digitorum longus is the extensor hallucis longus. If you remember back to the cadaver's clav, the deep fibular nerve was located between the tibialis anterior and the extensor hallucis longus in the deep compartment alongside the tibial artery. The tibial vein also is running alongside this area. The extensor hallucis longus also dorsiflexes the ankle and extends the big toe. The next compartment is the posterior side of the leg. This area has a lot of muscles, so let's move this like we're reading a book. This means that I'll start in the most superficial layer, and on that layer I will move down the leg and then to the right. As we start on the back of the knee, we have the popliteal artery and vein alongside the tibial nerve in the VAN order. Then we have the largest superficial muscle, which is known as the gastrocnemius. This muscle flexes the knee and plantar flexes the ankle. It is also known as your calf muscle. The next muscle is actually in the intermediate section, but can be poking out above the gastrocnemius. It is called the plantaris, and it focuses on flexing the knee and plantar flexing the ankle. The plantaris is a relatively thin muscle that originates on the femur condyle, but if you follow it down, then you'll see another muscle below it that is known as the popliteus. It is relatively small compared to the muscle that occupies the majority of the intermediate area, which is known as the soleus. The soleus is responsible for plantar flexion of the ankle. Moving to the deep part of the posterior leg, we begin with the flexor digitorum longus on the medial side. This is responsible for plantar flexing the ankle and flexing toes. Laterally, the tibialis posterior is found in the middle, which plantar flexes the ankle. Finally, the flexor hallucis longus can be found as the most lateral in the posterior compartment, which is responsible for plantar flexing the ankle and flexing the big toe. The flexor muscles are the natural counterparts to the extensor muscles in the anterior leg. The posterior tibial artery, tibial nerve, fibular artery, and fibular vein can all be found in the posterior deep section as well. It's easy to get lost with all these names, since there are so many muscles and important structures in this posterior area of the leg, so let's use a mnemonic to try to help us remember them. As I stated before, it might help if you read the muscles like a book, so I order them in the mnemonic in that order. We will begin with the gastrocnemius, then we'll have the plantaris, the popliteus, the soleus, the flexor digitorum longus, tibialis major, and then finally the flexor hallucis longus. We will use the first letter from each of these muscles to make a mnemonic. Get positively pumped. Serious flexing today, fam. It sounds like something you'd say at the gym, which is a perfect topic to remember all of these muscles. Finally, we look at the lateral leg, which only has a singular muscle out of the two in the compartment that we have to focus on for this lab. It is the fibularis longus, which is responsible for averting the foot. The common fibular nerve is also in this compartment, and it splits into the tibial nerve, which was in the posterior compartment of the leg, and the superficial fibular nerve, which can be seen easily on the surface of the lateral compartment. So anyways, that concludes this lecture. I hope you have a better understanding of the lower limb and will use this as a reference if you ever get confused in the future. Well, that's all I have to say. This was Carlos. Have a good one. Signing off.